For more on this high-profile detention, we're joined by Daniel Levin in New York City. He advises governments and agencies around the world on political and economic development. Daniel, how legitimate is this case against Huawei's CFO, and how common is it for governments to arrest company executives accused of violating sanctions?
I think in this form it's fairly rare. I mean, it's odd that this might be compared even to a fugitive Malaysian financier that is being sought in the 1MDB scandal. The thought that these two cases would be similar is a little silly. There's a lot of backdrop here. It goes back to 2012, even the House Intelligence Committee hearings against Huawei and ZTE. And then over the last few years, of course, the so-called death penalty that the U.S. tried to issue against ZTE before President Trump intervened in June. The allegations here go back to 2013, based on a subsidiary of Huawei called Skycom that the U.S. alleged was controlled by Huawei and was used for Iran to transfer U.S. technology. But the idea that this would be negotiated or prosecuted in this form is fairly unusual.
You mentioned ZTE. I mean, ZTE also accused of doing business with Iran, but handled completely differently. Basically, all ZTE had to do was pay a huge fine. So could we see some similar recourse in Huawei? I mean, what's the difference between these two situations?
Huawei was always viewed, based already on the House Intelligence Committee hearings in 2012 and then the Senate Intelligence Committee hearings this year. Huawei was always used as a much larger and much more threatening company to the U.S. and to U.S. competitors also. I think you have to put this also in the backdrop of the race for 5G technology, which is going to really take off in 2020, where Huawei is one of the leaders. People tend to forget that, certainly in the U.S., that Huawei is the second largest manufacturer of smartphones in the world after Samsung, larger than Apple. And so there's a lot of context here where ZTE is, even despite being a fairly large company, it's a much smaller geopolitical force viewed from the United States.
So basically, is the United States dictating how competitors do business? When you mentioned the whole 5G concern, what is the global view on this?
I think the first thing to remember, and this is a misconception of other countries about the U.S., is that the U.S. doesn't act in some kind of a concerted, uniform way. So what the Justice Department does is not necessarily coordinated with the White House. In particular, this White House, it doesn't seem very coordinated with it itself. John Bolton claims to have known about this impending arrest, but based on my sources, it's fairly clear that neither President Trump nor others in the White House knew about it. He's famously known for being a bottleneck to the flow of information already from his days in the United Nations. So it's possible that he knew and others didn't. But none of this seems very well coordinated, even within the Department of Justice. What is known in Washington is not necessarily shared or coordinated with the Eastern District federal prosecutors in the state of New York. So to think of this as a concerted U.S. government effort, I think, is wrong. But also we should remember that when it comes to trade and tariff disputes with China, it's probably one of the very few things that you have some form of bipartisan agreement in Washington. You had it in the Senate Intelligence Committee hearings where Senators Ron Wyden from Oregon and a senator from Arkansas, Tom Cotton, actually were in full agreement about China. And again, you don't see a lot of bipartisanship when it comes to China. You do see it, just like there's not much daylight between President Trump and Bernie Sanders on this one issue, perhaps this issue alone. So I expect this to get a lot uglier before it gets better. And it's somewhat odd because the technology companies and the two governments are so intertwined on the supply chain for these technologies. You'd think that there'd be enough rational reason to synchronize and coordinate in a more pleasant way.
Daniel Levin, always great to hear your thoughts. Thank you for joining us from New York.
Thank you.